Welcome, everybody, to today's panel discussion, the creation of the Vanishing, its next steps, and its impact as a tool to teach about the Holocaust. I am Anna Schumann, board member of New Cracow Friendship Society and granddaughter to two survivors. As we are an organization founded by Holocaust survivors from Krakow, Poland and Polish Galicia, the members of this organization understand how important education is and getting Holocaust stories out there, which falls in line to our wonderful panel discussion we're going to have today. After the discussion, there will be a Q&A, so please be sure to add your questions into the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen, and at the end we'll get to as many as we can. And now let's meet our accomplished panel. David Michael Slater is an acclaimed author of nearly 30 books for children, teens, and adults. His picture books include Hanukkah Harvey versus Santa Claus and The Boy and the Book. His early chapter book series include The Super Dupers and Mysterious Monsters, which is in development for an animated series. His books for teens include Sparks and the Forbidden Book series. His newest title, which we are discussing today, is The Vanishing, a Holocaust Fantasy, which has been praised by Holocaust authors, professionals, professors, and 6 National Jewish Book Award winners, and has already won Best Book of the Year from the American Writing Awards, Best Young Adult Fantasy from American Fiction Awards, and was a finalist in the Young Adult Teen Book categories in the Independent Author Network's Book of the Year Awards. Negotiations are underway with a major Hollywood production company for its film rights. David's nonfiction includes We're Doing It Wrong, 25 Ideas in Education That Just Don't Work and How to Fix Them, and Wingnuts, a field guide to everyday extremism in America. David teaches middle school in Reno, Nevada. For more, you can check out his website, which I will put down in the chat in a little bit. Our next panelist is Jay Lender, who has a long and lucky career writing, storyboarding, directing, and composing the occasional song for classic cartoons like Disney's Phineas and Ferb, Nickelodeon's SpongeBob SquarePants, Hey Arnold, and others. The Nosferatu gag, that was him. He's been nominated for 2 Emmys and lost both, but the fight continues. In addition to his work in animation, Jay has written a number of video games for franchises like Looney Tunes, Destroy All Humans, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, The Dukes of Hazzard, and even The Sopranos. His live-action film, They're Watching, co-written and directed with frequent collaborator Micah Wright, is streaming now, and their graphic novel, Duster, a feminist World War II homefront action story, is available through his website. The Vanishing is Jay's 3rd screen adaptation of a David Michael Slater novel, and with luck, will be the first one produced. And now for our panel, for our moderator today, is Susan Dubin. Susan is the library and education consultant for the Sperling Kronberg Mack Holocaust Resource Center. An educator for over 40 years, she has taught all grades from preschool through college and served as a school librarian from 1982 to 2012 in Los Angeles before relocating to the Las Vegas area. As a grant coordinator for the Tools for Tolerance for Librarians program through the Simon Wiesenthal Museum of Tolerance, she helped teach workshops, write curriculum, and interface with other leaders in the field of Holocaust education. At the Sperling Kronberg Mack Holocaust Resource Center, she has created and developed teacher training curriculum on the varied themes of the Holocaust and has taught educators and administrators in the Clark County School District and the Washoe County School District. Her involvement in Holocaust education also includes membership on the Holocaust Education Conference Committee, past president of the Association of Jewish Libraries, member of Association of Holocaust Organizations, and a member of the Nevada State Department of Education Subcommittee on Holocaust and Other Genocides. Like I said, our very accomplished panel. So at this point, Susan, I'm going to throw it over to you.
Thank you, Anna. Welcome, everybody. Hi, Jay. Hi, David. There. It's good to see you again.
You too.
Could you give us a little bit of a background information about the two of you, how you met, what kinds of projects you like to work on?
David, go first, always. Okay, I'll start. So that very long intro covered a lot of my work. I've pretty much dabbled in almost all fiction genres. I started off writing short stories for adults. One of them turned into a picture book for kids and took me down that path. At that time, started writing a novel for adults, wound up writing a series of middle grade novels, also wound up writing some early chapter book series. I'm even working on a musical. So all across the board. I'll let Jay do a short version of his as well, and then I guess I'll explain how we finally got together.
How did I get started? Is that where we are?
Yes.
What kind of work?
From the time I was a little kid, I always knew I was going to do either animation or comic books. Once I understood that Bugs Bunny didn't just happen, that people actually had to make Bugs Bunny happen, I knew I wanted to be one of them, or to work in comic books. And I've been very lucky in my career to get to do both of those things, as well as video games and live action film and illustration here and there. Wherever, whatever they let me do from one moment to the next is what I do. So after 6 years of art school, I managed to get my foot in the door at Nickelodeon very early on in their animation studio history. I worked on Hey Arnold and SpongeBob, and then moved out and did other things. I sort of float with the current, and one day I floated up next to David, and here we are. I can tell that story very briefly. David is a fearless cold caller. There's nobody that he won't get on the phone with. He routinely has conversations with people in Hollywood that I wouldn't dare to approach in any way, even through email. And I think they're all very happy to speak to him because he's an author, and we all have imposter syndrome in Hollywood, and we don't think of what we do necessarily as real art. And when a novelist calls, you take the call. So about 7 or 8 years ago, he called a low-level producer that I knew, and I don't know that that's someone who could have gotten one of his movies off the ground, but by gum, David's going to call everyone, and thank God he did, because this producer didn't know what to do with this author who had called him up, and he wrote me. We had worked together in the past, the producer and me, and he thought, this guy's Jewish, you're Jewish, maybe you could figure something out. So I got the email while I was on the plane heading to the East Coast, and it scrolled away, and I forgot about it for 2 years. And then one day when I was catching up on some old business, it finally worked its way back up to the top of my stack. I read David's book, Fun and Games, from a couple of years back. It's about a young kid growing up in the 80s, Jewish, East Coast, trying to keep his head down in a family of very opinionated people and accomplished people, with a father who's sort of marginally famous. And it spoke to me in a big way. I felt like, this is my guy. He's telling the stories that I would tell if I had ability in that arena. And we got together. I wrote the first adaptation of one of his stories with that. And I think it's going to make a great movie when its time comes around. We've done one other one since, but right now is the time for The Vanishing, the latest book, and I think the one that has the biggest reach. I think everyone will want to, and everyone should read and see this particular story, especially right now.
So David, what drew you to tell this story now?
We've talked before, so I have trouble giving one answer to your
Yes.
question, so I'll give a couple. Because actually, the more I've talked about this, the more I realize there's more to it. But the original answer I give, the conscious reason, was just that it occurred to me one day that it would just make an awesome story if there was an invisible character in the Holocaust. Since then, though, it occurs to me that the Holocaust plays a part in a lot of my work, all the way back to Fun and Games that Jay was just discussing, that family is impacted. Its history and some generational trauma, starting at the Holocaust, affects this boy in the 80s. And it pops up in the not second novel Jay adapted Sparks, which is a sci-fi sort of thing about modern Nazis. Um, and it's popping up in the musical I'm working on about Stanley Milgram and the shock experiments, which were done to, he was trying to figure out why his theory was that Germans were like congenitally obedient, and he tried to do an experiment here to set a baseline, and the results he got from Americans were shocking, to say the least. So anyway, it keeps coming up, and I don't know exactly why, because I don't know. I'm sure that I've lost family in the Holocaust, but I don't know of any of them. My grandfather came as an 11-year-old from Bessarabia. So I don't have direct connection, though I've learned about it most of my life. So there's that. And then my wife pointed out to me that I started this book not too long after the shooting at Tree of Life. I grew up literally across the street, diagonally from the Tree of Life. I had a chance, a friend who also grew up in that area is high up in the AP, and he reached out to me and asked me to write a short piece, which I was fortunate enough to get published. So I think it was on my mind at the time, always on my mind apparently, but especially on my mind after that happened. So that's what got me started with the book.
Jay, what drew you to want to make this book into a film?
Well, as a filmmaker and maker of television, everything I read, I'm always looking at it through that lens to see if this would make a great movie. And when I read this story, and I'm reading everything that David does now, I saw right away that this thing is incredibly visual. It's a great story, and it will have an enormous amount of impact on the screen. The second I started reading it, I'm starting to think about how you would bring this story to the screen. But of course, like David, I can see what's going on in the world around us right now, and the risk of getting ahead of ourselves. However it is we've been discussing this topic for the past 75, close to 80 years, it's not working. We have, if you look out of the street right now, you can see people yelling, "Jews will not replace us." We have one major political party in this country whose policies might as well be Nazi policies. We have literal Nazis in the army in Ukraine, and it's all very complicated. And sort of, I think a weird invisible elephant in the room right now is that not 2 days ago, we had a pogrom in the West Bank led by Orthodox Jews against Palestinians. This is in a country that was forged out of the fires of the Holocaust. And if you can't stop Jews from walking down this road, then clearly we need to reinvestigate how we're talking about this topic. I mean, we should be the last people on earth doing this, and yet we are. So there's a huge need for this right now, for the book, and for potentially a movie which could reach people in a different way, and even larger, broader groups of people. This is a discussion we need to have, and it can't always be a discussion of nonfiction. It can't always feel like vegetables, like eating your vegetables. We have to find ways to reach people that can engage them in this topic in a way that we haven't done yet.
That brings me to one of the questions I have for David. David, there are some really dark passages in the book. Why do you think it's more engaging for young people to read a novel like this than to use a nonfiction book on the subject of the Holocaust?
Well, I don't know that dark passages is necessarily an appeal to young people, but I would say that at least the middle schoolers I teach with are fully capable of engaging with the truth, however awful it is. So that's one thing. I think students sort of, I don't know that they resent getting watered down information, because sometimes they don't even know that it's watered down, but I do think they understand when they're either hearing the truth or being pointed toward the truth. I think what's more engaging about this book for young readers, actually for I'm a little uncomfortable talking about it as if it was especially designed for younger readers, because it really wasn't. But I do think it may have a special appeal for young readers, in that it's just an unusual approach. Magical realism is not your first expected way to enter into a discussion about the Holocaust. It's certainly not the first book. I know off the top of my head, there's a couple. Number of the Stars has a little bit of magic happening into it. The Red Magician is a sci-fi book that takes place in the Holocaust. So I'm not inventing that, but from feedback from both adults and kids, they say it's the combination of realism and magical realism, or the use of magical realism, which is mostly realistic. We can talk about that. Just has impacted them in a way that many of them say they haven't. Even some folks who say they've read, like, all they read is World War II fiction. So there's something a little bit unique and different about how it lands.
Were there particular books or authors that influenced you in your writing of this book?
Well, I started writing after reading the short stories of Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine fabulist or magical realism. He's probably the father of it all with Marquez. And he goes for a feeling, what he calls irreality. And he is just an incredibly amazing way. I mean, when I put down the first story I read, my head was sort of spinning, and partly just because of the great story, but also wondering how in the world can he create, like, in 11 pages, a feeling of, like, awe. And he has an amazing way. Magical realism most of the time really just has one magical feature that's often not explained or barely explained, and it's just taken for granted as a given in that world, and everything else is realistic. And what I feel is that somehow, and this is what I was going for with this book, so I was sort of answering your question again about what's different, is that it creates kind of a otherworldly feeling where you're simultaneously thinking as you read, this is not my world, but it's saying something profound about my world. It is my world in a deeper way. So he's the biggest influence on almost everything I write. I would also name two others. Steve Stern, National Jewish Book Award winner, I think maybe one of the greatest living writers, not recognized enough, in my opinion. His books are the opposite. They're just like exploding with Jewish mythology and legend and folktale, just dripping out of the books. So those inspired me, maybe just in terms of applying magic realism and fantasy to Jewish stories. And I keep neglecting in all my conversations about this to also mention Jan Martel, the author of Life of Pi. And that book had a great effect on me, and even more his follow-up, which doesn't seem like was remotely as famous, called The High Mountains of Portugal. He just, to me, is a master of creating that this world but otherworldly effect, where something profound, even if you can't, like, name it in a sentence, just this feeling that there's something so deep happening, even in the superficial story, as it might seem. So I'll go with those three.
So, Jay, David has really talked at length about his use of magical realism in this book, and that's truly what makes it unique. How are you going to handle those magical aspects through film?
Well, David mentioned that it's not that there's a lot about this world that seems unfamiliar or that is magical. It's removed from our reality in that it's not based in specific fact, in that it takes place all in Germany for the convenience of storytelling at a concentration camp that doesn't exist, in cities and neighborhoods that don't exist, but it's entirely true to the spirit of the times and to the general ideas that are part of that story of history. But there's really only the one element of this that is magical, and it's sort of easy to describe Sophie, the main character's invisibility as a superpower, and that is kind of an explanation of the way we would engage younger audiences and younger readers with this material. But it's not so much a superpower of being unseen as it is a superpower to see. Because she can't be seen herself, she has access to everything that's happening in Germany, in the Europe of wartime. She starts out in the shtetl, she works her way into the ghetto, to a camp, into the woods with the partisans, and then beyond and to America. And she can have this full range of Jewish wartime experience that any other one person in the real world could not have had, because you just don't get to do all of those things. But she does. In terms of how it would end up on screen, I want to make sure everyone understands, first of all, that we're talking about a live action movie, regardless of my history. Storytelling is storytelling. So I'm writing this assuming it will be live action. But what you won't be seeing a lot of in this is Sophie disappearing and footsteps appearing in the mud. There's none of that. Sophie is our lens on the story. We see everything through her, and she can see herself. So to herself, she's not invisible. She will simply walk through scenes where other people are doing things and where she's doing things, and she will not be noticed by them. She slips through a door just before it closes. She does what she needs to do to get around, but the fact of her invisibility is not an attraction, and it's not a special effect. There are very, very few moments in this movie, in the movie version of this story, where there would be an invisibility effect. Most often, something that needs to move through the room that she's carrying, but only when someone else is watching it. So you can literally count on your hand the number of times when there would be an effect connected to invisibility in this movie. It's not a special effects movie, and it's definitely not a superhero movie.
That being said, Jay, were there some films that influenced you in how you want to go, the direction you want to go with this particular film?
I'm not looking for comps, we would say, in Hollywood for films that are like this or hit this territory. I'm trying to treat it as its own thing, but as a filmmaker, the sum of everything I've ever seen is in my head somewhere, and you learn techniques and ideas and feelings from other places and apply them as best you can. You're not going to go to see this movie and see Del Toro or Jodorowsky. It's just not. I mean, when we say magic realism, I think it's a much more sedate form of magic realism than that kind of thing. There's not an enormous amount of magical symbology happening on screen. I think the simplest filmmaking is the best. And here, maybe because there's so much else going on, there's enough input for the audience just with the ideas that are happening and the simple idea of Sophie's invisibility. I wouldn't want to get too fancy with the visuals at any one point. I think the goal should be to get out of the way and let the story happen on screen.
Thank you. Recent statistics show that over 60% of the teens and young adults in America never heard of the Holocaust. How do you see your book or your film being used to educate these young people?
Well, I don't know. I hope it's a success and it reaches people. So there's no guarantee. But if it does, I think we talked a little bit about how it may engage teenagers and younger people. Honestly, I mean, the statistics for adults are not that much better. So I'll speak for all of them. If anything, if it could be a conversation starter, if it can just enter the culture. I mean, it's sad to say that it's the right time for it. I mean, most writers, prayed that their book is historically hitting at the right time, but it's a depressing fact. But if that happens and it can start some conversations, it would be fantastic. I should just point out, Jay pointed out that there are lots of factual changes. So there is a note in the back of the book to make it super clear that these changes were made for the reasons Jay said, for storytelling purposes and to capture the spirit of the times. And what I ask the reader to do at the end is, if I've spurred their interest in this, to go to start digging into the facts for themselves, then it would be a huge success. And obviously, the more people we reach, the more possibilities there are for that.
Yeah.
Do you see this as ultimately being something that could be used as part of the curriculum in schools?
If I hope so. I mean, the times are pretty awful for any book that anybody finds offensive at all. You know, so this is definitely a stretch. It would require, for sure, high schoolers, older high schoolers could handle it. I teach gifted and talented middle schoolers, and we read some pretty tough stuff. They would have no problem with it. But do we have brave teachers and brave school districts and who want to actually teach history? So we'll see. I do have hopes for it, though.
Jay, is there any possibility that the film that you make could be designed so it could be used in a classroom?
I don't know that there are any reasons why any film could not be used in the classroom. But what I wouldn't want is for this film to be someone's only exposure to the ideas here. I think that, the novel and the film, we have a real leg up on history because we're crafting intentionally an emotional experience for the reader. And we don't have to stick to facts because there sort of are no facts for fiction. I mean, this is based on actual events, but not specific events. So David has the luxury, and I have the luxury, to place a horrific moment against a laugh for maximum impact, to create the kind of engagement that will make this interesting, dare I say, entertaining for anyone who might encounter it. But this shouldn't be the only history they get. It's not history, like we mentioned. It feels like history. It might as well have been history, but there was no concentration camp where this takes place, and there was no invisible girl. But what we get out of it that the historians don't get is we can tell the story through the eyes of a single individual and force you to identify with that person and experience it as though you were there, or as though you had witnessed these events. Historians have to stick to those facts, and I think one of the really upsetting things about telling the history of the Holocaust is that satellite's eye view of the events forces us all to look at it like the Nazis did. We see numbers, we see quantities of human beings moving through the camps and the ovens and on the trains, and we don't feel a story being told. It's too big to grasp at that size. This allows us to go in at a human scale and understand what happened, hopefully enough that you can then process the history when you read it. And I think, and I'm not an educator, but I think that this book would be really good in a sort of combined unit. This is the English class, you read the book, or the literature class, and at the same time, you're talking about the history, the actual history in a history class. We used to do units like that when I was in school. I don't know how pervasive that kind of teaching is now, but this is the third time I'm saying it, I would never want this to be someone's only experience with this story.
Yeah, let me pick up back with that same question. Also, I see a question about whether using magic will dilute the reality of the Holocaust, which I think is a very fair question. And most people, when I tell them what the premise of the book is, they raise their eyebrow, and I think that's really natural. So it's a good place for me to mention that I was extremely afraid of how this book would go over. And even while I was sending it to publishers, I sent a manuscript to people like you, lots of scholars, lots of well-published authors of fiction and nonfiction. And I can't say they've all loved him, but almost all of them did. Michael Berenbaum, we talked about a little bit last time, world-renowned Holocaust scholar, loved it. And what they were saying is what Jay is pointing at, which is that this does something that nonfiction cannot do. And it grips the reader, it brings them through the story, and it just sort of begs them to go learn more about what this was. So I think that skepticism is fair, but I think people should find out for themselves. Also, in terms of curriculum, I teach a unit on the Holocaust, and we read a book called by Olivia Bitten Jackson called "I Have Lived a Thousand Years," and it does a really great job. And I think I took something from that book without realizing it, which I'm going to set aside for a second. One of these people, and come back to it, one of the folks that I sent the manuscript to is a retired professor named Arthur Shostak, who's on a lifelong mission or career-long mission to correct what he sees as the flaws in how Holocaust education is done. He thinks there are two stories to teach. One he calls the horror story, and that's the one everyone teaches, and he certainly says that it must be taught. But he thinks we're making a big mistake by only teaching the horror story because it turns people off. People just they shut off when it's too awful. It reminds me of the black lung commercials, PSAs from the 70s about smoking, which were a huge sensation until they did the studies that found out it doesn't work. And they found out it doesn't work because you can scare people into shutting out your message. And that's where the brilliant friends don't let friends drive drunk came from, that understanding. So anyway, he thinks that there's another story which he calls the helper story. He sent me his textbook, amazing, called Hidden Altruism. And he thinks we need to see the story, and it's much more palatable when we understand that it just wasn't all horror. There's incredibly altruistic, brave, selfless acts from Jews, not just non-Jews. We have some of those stories, but from the Jews, sometimes even in the camps. So back to my point for curriculum, I think A Thousand Years does that a lot. Her character, it's a memoir, and the thread we pull through that book is her unbelievable resilience and positive attitude. So I think that one possible appeal of this book as a teaching tool is that there is so much good, there's so much inspiring stuff that Sophie not only conducts herself, but sees in all the victims that she's trying to help.
Thank you. I definitely agree as an educator that is an extremely important aspect of the Holocaust education that we need to emphasize more. One of the areas in which you really bring out Sophie's bravery, her courage, and how that inspired others is when you talk about the partisans. And there was a large section of the book that actually looked at Sophie, looking at the partisan movement. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about how you gathered information about the partisans and what you chose to include, because unfortunately there are not a lot of books that deal with that, especially with how young people were involved.
Yeah, sure. So I'm sort of a haphazard learner. So there was no single text I could point to where I got that information, but I've been exposed to Holocaust education since I was like 9 years old in Hebrew school. And then, so I didn't mention, I mentioned that I grew up in Squirrel Hill and I was a lifelong Camp Ramanik. So there's nowhere in my life where Holocaust education was absent for very long. And now I go to amazing professional developments on it here in Reno. So what went into this book, the recipe for this book were just all the things that have accumulated in my mind that stuck, that impacted me the most, that I found the most profound, either for horrible reasons or for inspiring reasons. So I knew I actually, excuse me, I'm a pantser in terms of writing as opposed to a plotter. But in that for people means you either plot it all out ahead and write it, or you fly by the seat of your pants. I usually do that, but this book was a sort of mix because of what I knew enough about the Holocaust. I knew she was going to be in a shtetl. I knew she was going to be taken to a ghetto. I knew she was going to go to a camp, and I knew she would wind up in the woods with the partisans. So it was only when I went to set down the details that I had to look for specifics. And so this sort of actually answers the second question in the Q&A about whether I've watched testimonies. So I found testimonies, both video and transcripts, and that's where I got some of my specific information about the partisans and actually about things all through the story. And I also benefited from, like I mentioned, I had sent the manuscript out to bunches of scholars and writers, and it's incredible how generous people can be sometimes. They would come back to me with some suggestions for specific details or corrections. So that's how all those details accumulated.
Jay, do you have anything that you'd like to add about how you're going to treat that particular aspect in the film?
The partisans?
Yes, and the
At
helpers.
this point, yeah, at this point, the story has been written. My job is to be true to David's vision within the limitations of filmmaking. It's a very different medium. Filmmaking is external, it's visual. Novels are internal. Your characters are thinking a lot. You experience the world through their heads, and I can't do any of those things. So, the big changes that will happen are really just in finding ways to externalize what's internal. But in terms of the bones of David's story and certainly the partisans, I don't have big changes to make there. There were a couple of moments that need to be cut just to keep it moving along. And that sounds like a put down, but it's not. I mean, we're talking about a different medium, and the audience will stand for certain things in a book that they won't stand for in film. And if I can depart a bit, I'll give you an example. There's a moment and an idea in the book about child experimentation. And it is incredibly gruesome and graphic, and you are made to dwell on it. And it is a good thing in the context of a book to do that. I need to find a way to get that notion on screen without showing that visual, because that would be the bridge too far. That would be 10 bridges too far for almost anyone in the audience. And then I would lose them for the rest of the movie and the message of the movie. So in adapting from the text to film, certain things change, certain things are lost. But what doesn't change about the partisan section is that it's a really interesting break from everything else in the book. It has some of the darkest moments in it. Because even though the camp is incredibly vile and awful, we don't necessarily know everyone to whom the things are happening, but we get to know the partisans really well. And what happens to them really matters. Also, Sophie, after spending most of this story desperately acting to make things happen, has finally found other people, other Jews who are working to stop the terror. And she gets to take a break and allow them to come into the forefront while she considers and they consider, and Gideon, who is the second main character in this book, they all consider what their lives are going to be after this, if there is an after this, and what all of this will mean. And it's my favorite part of the story. I think it will be everyone's favorite part of the story, if you can be said to have a favorite part of a story like this. But yeah, I don't think you'll see a lot of differences, but they are certainly incredible characters.
There is some measure of revenge in the book. What is the message regarding revenge that you want to convey to your readers and the people that are watching the film?
That's for me.
Yes.
Let me say, I think probably I could speak for most fiction writers that fiction is more about questions than answers. You know, I don't have that many answers. I have two very thin nonfiction books to prove that I don't have that many answers. So in some cases, I'm just asking the reader to ponder it. I don't have an answer about revenge. I will admit that I take great pleasure in certain scenes of revenge in that book. I took great pleasure. I didn't mention Tarantino's Inglorious Bastards. I love that movie, but I'm not sure of feeling so good about those things. And it's one of the struggles. Sophie struggles with a lot of uh, internal turmoil about what she should do, what's okay to do, and how she should feel about it. Um, but I do have her just do what she eventually feels that she needed to do, and I'd like to leave it to the reader to determine for themselves, how they feel about it.
Jay, do you have anything to comment about that particular aspect of the story?
I think it is incredibly cathartic when we get to that. But David is also very careful to make it clear that nothing has been changed by it. So it's sort of the catharsis of it exists in a moral vacuum in a way. And I don't think I can elaborate on that without giving anything away. But I think that the audience and the readers desperately need it when it happens. And it certainly goes to the fantastic element of the story. I think the audience should encounter it on their own and make their own, draw their own conclusions.
I'll just throw in related that for folks that haven't read the book yet, that Sophie fails a lot, not just in terms of revenge. She tries a lot of things. She succeeds a lot of times only to make things worse. So there's just a lot for any reader to kind of grapple with in terms of an individual. I mean, one of the things this book is about is what power does an individual, even one with superhuman power, have to affect the course of history. Can one person, no matter how special they are, turn the tide of evil when it's that great? That's just one of many, things to ponder about the story.
I think that you might expect that the companion to that idea, can one person make a difference, is that together we can all make a difference. I don't think that the book or movie makes that point. I think, and it doesn't make the point I'm about to tell you either, but I think if there's something we can draw from it, it's that the time to make a difference is before, not during. By the time you get to during, it's very difficult to stop the tide. And Sophie discovers that. Everyone in the book discovers that. But we have the opportunity now, if we do the right things, hopefully to stop the next book from being written, whatever that would be.
Yeah, that's probably my interest in the Milgram shock experiments. It's just it's a highly debatable study, and people dismiss it, but it is and will forever be in every intro to psych textbook, because whether or not it's a valid study, it is a conversation that you just have to have. What he found, and it's just frightening, how how easy it is to get otherwise good and decent people to do horrible things.
Absolutely. I know that you talked about Sophie wanting to influence the way things go, try to make things better. And one of the ways she does that is by mentoring Gideon. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Sophie and Gideon?
Yeah, sure. So the first draft of this book, the first scene was the horrible murders that Sophie witnesses that turn her invisible. And I immediately started thinking, I don't know if, well, first I thought, we have to get to know Sophie so that you really care enough. So I had to back the story up, and so you meet her and her family and their wonderful relationship and all of that. And then I foresaw, like I was talking about before, I foresaw the major locations of this book, and I had a pretty strong feeling that things would go bad constantly. And at some point I thought, you know what, who's going to keep reading this book? There are all these characters that I'm going to try to get you to care about, or not all of them, but many of them are not going to last very long. And I just wasn't sure a book showing continual failures and loss of lovable people would hold people. So I thought to myself, if Sophie cannot turn the entire tide of history, and if things keep going bad when she's trying to save large groups of people, she could definitely save one person. So that was the motivation for inventing Giddy. So Giddy's her 9-year-old, 2 years younger than her friend at the beginning of the story. And then he just provides, I mean, he became his own character and halfway took over the book. But he becomes that device that keeps the reader with Sophie's efforts all the way through to the end of the story.
How are you going to handle their relationship, Jay?
It's interesting because we have just a short amount of time in the story, and definitely in the movie, to establish that relationship, because it becomes one-sided very shortly. Giddy is still devoted to Sophie, and Sophie is devoted to Giddy, but they can't communicate in any way. And Giddy doesn't even know that Sophie is there, because she's invisible. So we have a very short time in which to make all of this so good and so compelling that you believe that this love between the two of them sustains through literally years of activity. And David laid out a roadmap that was very, very easy to follow. I don't know that, I mean, I can't give away anything about the story, but the dedication that Sophie feels toward Giddy, she's never not thinking about him. She's always concerned about Giddy. When she briefly falls off the wagon, she pays for abandoning her own mission briefly. Giddy is driven by his desire to stay alive so that he can find her, because she has disappeared. It's really beautiful, the relationship between the two of them, especially children. They're both very young. I think Giddy is 9 and Sophie's 12 when it starts. And this relationship is sustained, this disconnected relationship is sustained clear through into their teen years and beyond. I think David's right. The story would have been exhausting and miserable if we didn't have that thing there. In Hollywood, we call it the MacGuffin. Giddy is the MacGuffin. He's the thing that she has to get or protect or carry through the movie. But he's a MacGuffin who really, really thinks. It's the same kind of dynamic that you can see in The Mandalorian with The Mandalorian and the Baby Yoda, or The Last of Us, the zombie show on HBO now. There's, in those cases, it's an adult and a child, but two people bonded together, desperate to save each other as they move through a horrific landscape. It's always a winner. I mean, the audience will always latch on to that, and I think it's going to be great in this case as well.
And just to keep bringing it back to curriculum, since that's part of our discussion, teaching tools, I think it's I think it's from Viktor Frankl. I think in his books that it was his observation that the people who survived had some reason to survive, whether it was a person, or in his case, I think to rewrite a manuscript the Nazis burned, just something. And so you can just see how that keeps Sophie from despair, that mission to save him.
Well, thank you both for your wonderful insights and for this wonderful story that you are sharing with all of us. I love the book, The Vanishing, and I do use it with my classes. We do have some questions in the chat, I guess in the Q&A, and you've answered some of them already, but there's one that I want to share with you and then have your thoughts on it. There's a new documentary about the partisans called Four Winters. The interviewees were all nonagenarians. None mentioned children among them. How old is Sophie? The youngest seemed to have been in their late teens. Were there many children fighting among the partisans? And then I have something to answer after you share.
Oh, okay. It's funny because so Giddy by the time he's there is like 12, she's like 15, but she's not fighting with them. She's just kind of stuck, as Jay was saying, there watching things happen. And Giddy wants to fight desperately, but they won't let him. Um, but it's funny that question because I mentioned that not everyone I sent the book to loved it, which is expected. It's this approach is definitely not for everyone. But one particular woman, a Jewish author, was furious about all kinds of things. One of which was that she was outraged that Giddy wasn't allowed to fight because she said kids were, as I don't remember the age, but very young kids were fighting in dangerous situations with the partisans. So that's my understanding.
I actually know of a survivor who I've had speak many times. She passed away just recently, but she was actually 5 when she was in the partisans, and she was given a gun for her birthday, and she actually fought with them as a young child between the ages of like 6 and 9. So there were some young children. It wasn't very common, but there were some, and definitely young teens were involved in the partisan activities. And some of them didn't let the partisan groups know their ages because they wanted to participate.
They lie, right?
Well, they, let's just
that's
say
like in
they
every army, in every
hide
war.
their truth. Yes.
Right. Yeah, and the just for the folks who haven't read it yet, the Giddy joins the partisans through some pretty unexpected, happenings.
Yes. So one of the comments in the chat was thanking you for sharing about stories about altruism. And you do go into that in the book, especially through Sophie's mentoring of Giddy. But were there other characters in the story that you felt were examples of the altruistic personality?
It's funny. I wish that Arthur Shostak came to me earlier before the book because I think I would have made a bigger deal of it. I've since he has so many stories like um, the Jews that were on the platform unloading other Jews, whispering in their ear, "You're this age, you're that," little things like that that could have gotten them killed. So I have, they're in the ghetto. Um, there's a couple that Giddy's parents that he's crammed into a tiny room with, and I don't want to give too much of the story away, but through Sophie's intervention, they have some extra food, and instead of eating that extra food, they're giving it away, to people in dire straits. So there's a couple examples like that, and like I said, I wish I, made even bigger deal of it. I'll say as a teacher, sorry, the it's not just the horror story as a problem. It's the image of Jews as sheep to the slaughter that I think folks who actually have some Holocaust education have that in their head as pretty much the only scenario.
You did a good job in the book of sharing how that is not the case and how people were brave and did stand up for what was right. Jay, do you have a way of highlighting some of those moments in your film?
Moments of altruism?
Yes.
Yeah, they loom large, probably larger in the film just because stuff needs to be compressed and cut. But the basic idea of the characters that David's talking about, Giddy's parents, and then some others later on in the book who are connected to the partisan movement, those things really loom large because they occupy a larger portion of the movie. So, I mean, this is one of the things that movies have to do is boil things down. So big ideas I try not to eliminate big ideas. You have to pick and choose among some of the small ideas, but I definitely did not want to lose any of those moments as I was going through it, because I think they're important for the same reason that some of the other things are important, that the contrast, like you're talking about Shostak's theory that you need to have, the one side where we see the horrors and then also that ray of light. It's because the contrast and the context of each thing in the context of the other thing creates the interest and the engagement. If you have a terrifying moment in your movie, you want it right after a laugh so that the audience feels that dive. That's what makes the impression. That's what we can do in fiction that you can't necessarily do in a historical account. So I'm always looking for those things. And when I saw a moment in this book where there was, some altruism, particularly coming from someone who isn't necessarily Jewish, I grab onto it like a life raft, because I know I need that to make the horror that came before and the one that's coming after resonate with the audience. Otherwise, it becomes a flat line and you lose interest in what's happening if it's all the same tone.
Thank you, David and Jay, for your wonderful insights and for your comments. Do you have any last thoughts as we wrap up?
Oh, no, I just want to thank Anna and Stephen and the whole organization for giving us this opportunity. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Ditto to all of that, and I'm always thankful to you, David, for dragging me along with you. I'm happy to ride on your coattails and be a part of this story. It's great.
Anna?
And now just a final thank you, David, Jay, Susan. I think this was really, really interesting and really kind of gave some perspective to the value of having a fictionalized Holocaust story. I mean, because it's a good opportunity to draw in an audience that wouldn't necessarily seek out a biography or a documentary to kind of get them interested and then want to learn more. I think that's an incredible goal. So thank you for joining us. There will be an email going out within the next couple of days. It'll have a link to this recording on our YouTube page. It's also going to have links to our panelists' websites, so you can check out their work. And if you haven't read The Vanishing yet, now would be the time. And we'll be sure to keep tabs on the progress of pre-production for the film and keep all of our members informed. So on behalf of the new Cracow Friendship Society, thank you all who also tuned in to watch with us, and to our president, Steve, who helped put this, who's responsible for putting this program together. All right, thank you all. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.